Before we begin, minor bookkeeping note, you may have noticed that the channel's name has changed. The reason that I changed this name is we're trying to be extremely inclusive to some of those internet warriors who commented on that last video. And one of the comments, I'll go ahead and paraphrase so you can't look up exactly who it is, but he said, "John, you are the most dangerous swordsman I've ever seen use this, and you should not be online to teach that." So to help correct my mistake a little bit, I went ahead and just renamed the channel, pulled out some super awesome gear. Most dangerous swordsman seems to suit me, as I like to double a lot. That's where it came from. And as we grow bigger, hopefully that we'll be able to develop as a HEMA practitioner, become less dangerous. Or indeed, keep having the same amount of fun that we were having before. Allow me to tell you a story. Many, many years ago, when I was first beginning out in HEMA, I was sitting down in a nice, organized cutting class. It was put on by a traveling instructor, came in from Southern California. I was called out of the crowd at that time to come and stand up, and before him had an array of swords on the table. He picks one up, and he asks me to hold it, and I put it in my hands, just like this. He says, "What do you think about this sword?" I said, "Well, it's a pretty good sword, but I don't know a whole ton about it." So I set it back down. He goes through a full diatribe on why that sword is amazing, how cool it is, why he chooses it as his personal cutting sword, and then says, "This sword is meant to deal serious damage to your opponent, and if I wanted to, I could use it to cut your head off." And I was immediately in love. This sword we are looking at, the Albion Viceroy. The best, most incredible sword known to man. Now, many people will ask, well, what is the best sword? Why is it this sword specifically? Now, the first thing that you'll see when you introduce a sword to somebody online, saying that it is one of your favorites, they'll say, "Oh, well, what about this sword? What about this sword? What makes a good cutting sword? Why is this sword specifically the best one that I own? My favorite sword to cut with?" Now, you kind of have two different opinions in the HEMA community, at least, of what makes a good cutting sword. We obviously see a lot of the Albion Alexandria pictured here. Albion Alexandria is known as one of the best singular cutting swords, but you'd never find that sword on a battlefield. Now, why is that? Now, if we take a look at the Alexandria, we kind of flip it on its side and look down the end of the blade, we can see that it has a very distinct thin blade and it's bendy. Also, the blade is very, very, very thin. I'll go ahead and play some footage for you of Skallagrim using his sword to try and cut into a zombie skull simulator. You can see that it has that nice big dent about that far that goes in just from hitting the brow on this zombie tool's head. What does that tell us? Sword might not be best for combat use against more stiff targets. Great tatami cutting sword, not so great at that. Now, if we go on the other spectrum, there's a lot of people online, I think the colloquial term is weeb, who's very much into katanas, is their big thing. And katanas are really cool. They can cut tatami really well. They are a bit short. They don't have a handle guard. Not really something that most HEMA practitioners will look towards. Now, why did I choose this sword as my cutting sword? First off, if we take a look down here at the profile, we have that nice fat ricasso there. Not only is this an amazingly good center of balance on the sword, where it brings back the weight very significantly all the way towards the hand, so you have tons of point control, which is great for those more advanced cutting feats, namely things like the thrust to cut, where you thrust into the tatami mat, withdraw the sword, and then have to do a cut in the same motion. This sword does exceptionally well. So this is known as a Type XXa blade, or there's some argument going back to like 18A blades based on the typology of this guy. It's based on a sword that is an arming sword of different proportions, and they turn it into a very beautiful long sword. See that lovely cross guard right here? Super solid, Nothing crazy going on there. We have a beautiful leather grip right there. Wire wrap right there. And some people will disagree whether or not they like the wire wrap. I find it to be a very good handhold for you. And it's a good idea to know if somebody has kind of sissy hands. If they can't grip that, you might want to not let them touch your super good cutting sword. Beautiful pommel right here. Not sure the typology on that. See how lovely and flat that is. It does rust quite a bit if you don't keep it maintained. You might see a little bit of surface rust on there that I'll clean up. Very clean tang. Very clean peen there at the bottom. As I was saying before, fat ricasso right here. Blade starts pretty thick, but tapers out really, really quickly to a super wicked point. If you look there at that point, not the skinniest point in the world. Obviously, you can get things like rapiers and stuff like that that are pointier. But again, you want a very good general purpose longsword as the best sword ever. This does amazingly well cutting through tatami because it's wide, it's thin enough, and it's stiff enough that when you flex the blade, it doesn't have a whole ton of give. Now, Albion does an amazing job with their temper. You can see I can flex it super hard, and it returns back to exact true. This point right here, like I was saying, does really well about that penetrating tatami, withdrawing the sword, coming around, and cutting super smooth. It has a nice big taper, but it's still fat enough towards the end that we can cut with it. Now, this sword has performed amazingly well in cutting tournaments. And that same instructor, who I referenced before, uses this sword specifically, or a sword very close to this, made by Sterling Armory at this last combat con that we were at, because it's so good as a general purpose weapon, sword, tool. And like I was saying, there are swords that cut better, there are swords that thrust better, and there are swords that are made more specifically for like tatami. But this sword does an incredible job at exactly what a longsword should be. I'll go ahead and play some footage for you right now of what this sword looks like in tournament. I was able to perform fairly well at this last combat con. See some very nice cuts. Here's some footage of me cutting out some bottles outside. You can see how smoothly it glides through. Obviously, this sword being a super stiff one doesn't help a whole ton in the cut through like water bottle, because you hit the water bottle, it won't flex to try and get through the bottle easier. It'll just cleave right through, and you'll see a big explosion. So not only is this sword really good at cutting, but it'll also tell you if you're cutting wrong. Another reason that ricasso is so important is one of the cutting feats that have been more recently produced. We've seen where somebody will come with a pole arm to indicate a sword blow. You need to block it very strongly, cut through a tatami mat, block strongly again. Here's some footage of what that looks like. Now with the ricasso, because it is the way that it is, there's not an edge on that ricasso. You can deflect that pole. It won't bite into that pole and create friction, potentially throwing off your cut. Pole goes away, you cut, come back, block again.